All right, well, it is 1:30. I'm on Eastern Time, 10:30, so we'll get rolling here. Okay? So first, I just want to say thank you all for coming and hanging out during the session. For everyone who's dialed in remote, thank you for being here and checking this one out. Appreciate everyone's time. My name is Ryan. I work at Priceline. I oversee the product design team, the brand design team, and our user research teams. So a little bit about Priceline in case anyone's not familiar. Priceline is an online travel agency. So we sell hotels, flights, rental cars, packages, cruises, and experiences. Our mission at Priceline is to be the best travel deal makers in the world. And it's simple and it's meaningful. We want to help our customers find the best possible price for their next trip. Now, at Priceline, we're a high-velocity testing culture. We test a lot. On average, anytime you go to Priceline, there are around 100 tests running. So if you would all open up your laptops or look on your phones, you might see slightly different variations of the same thing. So constantly learning and iterating, and it's a great way to build a product. Now, that's not what I'm going to talk about today, but I promise this is going to, it will make sense. We'll come back to this one. But before we move on and get into it, I have a really important question to ask. I'm sure for some of you, this is the reason why you're here this week. I'm going to flip the slide. Just take a moment. When you know the answer, feel free to shout it out, all right? Would you rather be able to speak any language or be able to talk to animals? Come on, don't be shy. You're not going to get a participation trophy if you're quiet.
The logical answer is speaking any languages, but I would rather talk to my dog.
You'd rather talk to, okay. Fair enough, fair enough. That's, ooh, all right, you guys are going to have to debate after.
Can we do both?
No, you can only pick one. All right,
You could argue that talking to animals is speaking another language, though.
fair enough. That's a good point. I haven't heard that one yet. Okay. All right, well, thank you. Oh. I'm going to move forward here. I promise this will all come together at the end. At least I hope it does. So just a little bit about me. So I started off as a developer. I went to graduate school at NYU for UX research and programming. I spent time at agencies. I spent time at brands. I did pivot careers, and I'm going to talk about that in a little while. And then I got back into design, back into the agency world, and then ultimately ended up back at a brand. Now, the thing that I want to mention on this slide is each one of these roles, in some way, has been a key part of moving on to the next. And all have had valuable learning moments that have helped me along the way. So when we think about our careers, it's like a roller coaster. Sometimes things seem to go really fast. Sometimes it's a bit slow, and there's ups and downs and highs and lows and a lot of twists and turns. And in the past, I've usually come to these shows and I talk about design and building really cool products and conversion. And if anyone wants to catch up on any of those things, catch me after. Still like to talk about it. But today, I'm here to talk about my roller coaster story and share some of the things that I've learned along the way through both success and failure that have helped me. Another important thing that I hope to get across today is this concept of telling your story. Everyone has a story, and it's unique to you, and it's individual. And your story, there's so much to unpack in your story that will help you during moments of uncertainty, but also if you talk about it, there's probably a lot of things there that will help others who are going through something similar. This is a quote by Steve Jobs. This is one of my favorites. And what it says is, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. Now, there's a few things about this that I really like. One, even though we try and plan our lives in advance, there's something unpredictable that is always bound to happen. And number two, whatever we are going through today will somehow make sense down the road. So this is early on in my career. I thought everything was going to plan. My dots were connecting. I mentioned I started off as a developer. What I didn't say is I was a really bad developer. But I was more interested in how things are put together and why. And that led me to New York University, where I got a master's, and that's where I studied design, programming, and research. My thesis advisor at NYU happened to be the founder of RGA, which is a large digital agency. So I got a little bit lucky. Coming out of my thesis, he introduced me to some people at RGA, and I got my first real design job I spent 5 years at RGA, and I worked with some incredibly talented, smart, and creative people. After 5 years, I kind of feel like, okay, I get agency. I know what this is all about. I want to expand into brand. So I moved on to Yahoo. And Yahoo was a great place and a lot of great people at Yahoo. One thing about Yahoo at that time were layoffs were a pretty common yearly event. You kind of knew it was coming. So for me, it was a really good way just to understand the reality of working through the unknown. Now, when I was at Yahoo, I had a great manager, and you learn a lot from really good managers. You also learn a lot from the managers who aren't so good, and you try to take the good from the people that you really like, and you try to stay clear of the things that you didn't like from the bad managers. I had a great manager at Yahoo, and at the end of my first year, my manager was let go. On that same day, I was called into an office, and I was asked if I want to take over that team. So in that moment, I became the manager for a group of people who were, up to that moment, they were my peers, they were my friends. It was another really good lesson early on in building teams and building trust and helping to build relationships. It was awkward, but looking back, I really did get a lot out of that. And the next 2 years went by, and everything seemed to be going pretty well. November of 2010, I was laid off at Yahoo. My time finally came, and I had no idea that this was going to be the beginning of a really wild ride. So, laid off, trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. Now, this is a whole other really long story. I'm just going to make it really short. I had the opportunity to pivot careers and move into the fitness business. Now, I was always really interested in fitness. I had always wanted to start a business. I had no idea if this would work out. I just knew that my instinct was telling me I should give it a shot. It's the right thing to do. I also thought if it didn't work out, I have a design background. I could get right back into design. It should be easy, right? Not a problem. I learned quickly how difficult it is to be an entrepreneur. I also learned firsthand how hard it is to pivot careers. It took around 3.5 years to finally have the right people in place to help get the business to a place of being fairly stable. But at the end of the day, the gym wasn't really working out. This is my attempt at a dad joke, so there you go. It certainly wasn't working out at a level of being able to support a family. Now, there's some things you need to understand. You could evaluate success in a number of ways. Financially, the business was struggling. In terms of reward, it was pretty amazing. Being a part of seeing somebody hit their fitness goals, lose weight, seeing their lives change for the better, that's actually an incredibly rewarding thing. Now, another lesson from this, if you're a leader and you're managing a team and you're able to help influence somebody's career and help them get to where they want to be and have a positive impact on that person's profession, that's also incredibly rewarding. And the reason I bring that up is because I think sometimes that's easy to lose sight of. So I needed to get back into design. Interestingly, no one wanted to talk to me, right? I was working in a gym for the past few years, right? No one wanted to talk to me, and when they did, it did not go very well. See, one of the problems I had is I didn't stay current with industry trends. So when I left RGA, we were designing everything for the larger screen. If you wanted to design something for mobile, it was a completely separate experience. When I worked at Yahoo, I was working on an internal tool. We were only designing for one screen. So when I eventually did get somebody to talk to me and they asked me about responsive design, it was like mind blown, right? It did not go that well. Another thing I realized is I had no idea how to talk about my time owning a gym or being in the fitness space and how that might be relevant to design. So it was a struggle, right? I wasn't really going anywhere. I got a little bit lucky. A former colleague of mine from RGA was running the design team at another large agency and brought me in to do some freelance work. That kind of got me rolling again. I eventually landed a full-time job at a company called Cora, still had the gym running in the background. But getting that full-time job, I took a few steps back from where I left off a few years ago. It was a blow to the ego. But I knew I would eventually get back to where I wanted to be. Interestingly, my manager left that company after the first year, and I was asked to take over that department. So it's funny how history repeats itself. So finally, I'm back, right? 5 years running a digital team, running a UX and strategy team at an agency, realized, okay, I want to get back into the brand or product side. I ended up at a company called Pearson. I spent 4 months at Pearson. I realized pretty quickly that it wasn't the right place for me. And I think our careers are too valuable to spend time doing something that you don't truly love. Now, during that short period, I was really focused on 2 things. One was helping to rebuild a team, and 2 was helping that department start their first design system. An opportunity at Priceline came along, and 2 of the hot topics during that interview process were 1, building a team that needed some support, and 2, getting a design system rolling. So a lot of timing and coincidence coming into play here. And I firmly believe that if I didn't spend those 4 months at Pearson, I would have never got to where I am now at Priceline. So some things I've learned along the way. 1, as I've mentioned, we think we have a plan. Chances are that whatever your plan is today is going to change down the road. And regardless of why or how that plan has changed, there's a few things to keep in mind. Number 1 is embrace change. It's something we're all guaranteed to have to deal with. This next one is really important. Everything that we are going through today, the good, the bad, regardless of how things crazy get, things that make us feel good at the end of the week, all these things are like bookmarks, and you're going to fall back on these things at a later point. You don't realize it in the moment, but the present is really the best lesson plan for the future. Another important piece here is be open-minded, take risk, try new things. Trust your instinct. My instinct was telling me I should try and start a business, even if it was taking a big chance and moving into something I haven't done before. And the last piece here, you hear people say this all the time, but it is really true. There's nothing wrong with failing. If you don't fail, you're never going to learn, and you're never going to grow. And this next piece, this is mind-blowing. Just like failure, it's also okay to make mistakes. The important thing is to understand what went wrong during those mistakes and to use them as learning opportunities. So it doesn't matter how uncomfortable it might seem. The important thing here is trust the process. It took a while, but I learned that my time at the gym was almost like going to business school. I learned a lot that made me better at my job because I had a much better understanding how business works. I was better at being able to talk about what I do, being able to sell myself, and being able to sell design work. Another interesting thing I learned is building the gym wasn't about the equipment. It was about building a community. Designers, researchers, it doesn't really matter who you are or what you do. Everybody likes to be part of a community. And because of my time at the gym, I became good at building communities. And lastly, even though I wasn't successful in the fitness business, I learned so much that made me more successful and happier today because I took that risk. I had no idea that a change in plans would lead me to a career pivot that would lead me back to my initial career. Even though the business wasn't successful, I would go back in time and I would do it again in a heartbeat, right? But like I said, we have a plan. Your plans are going to change. So fast forward to September 2019. It's my first day at Priceline. I'm starting a new job. I'm finally where I want to be. I'm super excited. I'm motivated. Everything is on my side. I'm going to crush it. There's nothing that's going to get in my way. 5 months later, COVID hits. So I'm now at a job in an industry that was coming to a halt. I was working with a team that I wanted to be very hands-on with, and I wasn't going to be able to work with them in person. The headlines weren't pretty. It was all negative. There was nothing in the news that made you feel good, right? In fact, anytime the news came on, you heard something, it did nothing but cause worry and panic. This leads me to my next quote. I love quotes, if you can't tell already. I've lived through some terrible things in my life, some of which have actually happened. That's Mark Twain. And there's a simple truth to this. We spend so much time worrying about things that haven't actually happened yet. So anytime you're faced with the unknown, there is a moment of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And you could call it FUD. I know everyone loves a good acronym. Now, there have been instances at every job I've ever had that are filled with fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Let's take an example of FUD during COVID. when are people going to travel again? Now, first, there's the fear that comes along with it. We're in a pandemic. We don't really know a lot about it. Our first instinct is naturally to think about what's going to happen to us, what's going to happen to our family, what's going to happen to our friends. Next is uncertainty. What's going to happen to the business? Like, people aren't really traveling or moving around so much right now. And then finally, there's doubt. Immediately, it kind of goes to this negative space. There's no end in sight. It's going to be a long time before travel numbers get back to where they should be, and that's the last thing that you want to think about when you're working for a travel company, even more so when you just started at a travel company. But here's the thing, there's always a reality, right? And in this case, the reality is we learned how to be successful. And I want to talk a little bit about how that came to be. So, one, instead of dwelling on outcomes you have no control over, focus on the things that matter and that you could influence. Now, if something is important to you, that means it matters. And even though you don't have control, you can still have an influence. Having an influence means you have the indirect ability to shape an outcome. And then lastly, always look for things you can control. These are problems that you can directly solve. If you're able to have control, take advantage of it. So we didn't know when people would travel again, but instead of dwelling on that, we were able to move forward with a very thoughtful process. One, our mission still mattered. We talked about the mission early on. Our mission is to be the best travel deal makers in the world. That was still important. We had direct control over making sure we were behaving in a way that helped build customer trust. And it's something we can control, right? We shifted our strategy from doing all this testing for conversion wins to testing based on things that we knew were relevant and mattered in the moment. Messaging about safety, about cancellation policies, and cleanliness, as a few examples. So we were actually able to flip around our overall strategy to fit in what was happening at the time, because the hope was that that was going to make us more successful at the end of the day. We focused on the things that mattered, the things that we could influence, and the things that we could control. A few things that I'd learned out of this is, one, our leadership team did not panic. They stayed calm. And if you're a leader and you could stay calm during times of the unknown, everyone around you is more likely to stay calm and not panic. We were resilient. Not only did we change our testing strategy, our cares team was overwhelmed. If you could imagine, there's a lot of people who had trips that needed to be canceled. People in call centers weren't able to make it into the office. Many of us were helping by making calls to hotels and to airlines to help people get refunds for trips that were going to be canceled. Not what a lot of us expected to do, but we were resilient. We had to find a way to keep the business moving forward and to make sure that our customers are top of mind. We focused on solutions instead of just talking about problems. So you can always control an outcome. You can't always control an outcome, but you can always have an influence. So I'm going to shift it up a little bit here and talk about cognitive biases. As designers, marketers, and product people, we use cognitive biases all the time. We use these so that we use these to help people make purchase decisions. But did you know there's also cognitive biases that influence how we respond to changing circumstances? First is the ambiguity effect. This talks about how decision-making is affected by a lack of information. So if you're faced with a project at work that is clearly defined but has less overall value, or a project without much definition but incredibly high value, most people are going to select the project that's well-defined. Right? And one way to get through this is ask yourself, what are the questions or the benefits? What are the opportunities that come by taking on the unknown? Another one is the status quo. This is the preference for the current state of affairs. In the 1980s, Coca-Cola came out with a new Coke recipe. It had a sweeter test. They did blind taste testing. The new version of Coke overwhelmingly was a favorite compared to classic Coke. However, they put it on the shelves. Classic Coke outsold new Coke by three times as many sales. They had a little new badge on it, right? And even though there was a clear preference for the new Coke, people stuck with the status quo bias, right? They stuck with what they were accustomed to. If you're given a choice between two options, right? You're almost always going to choose the sure thing. And this is a good example of a time where it's okay to step out of your comfort zone. That will help you with the status quo bias. Last, we have the negativity effect, right? This is negative feelings over positive. This is why if you meet somebody and there's a really bad first impression, you're always going to remember it, right? You're always going to remember that bad first impression. It's also why the news is negative, right? It just sticks, right? People gravitate more towards the negative experiences. It's why the Good News Network hasn't taken off. You don't see this in the news too often. But really, it's recognizing that you're focusing on negative thoughts or feelings and trying to replace them with something positive. Now, the reason why this all happens is because our brains are wired to protect us from harm. If you're switching jobs, if you're moving, if you're faced with uncertainty, your brain is going to try to stop you. It's a part of human nature, right? And it's important to understand this. It's okay. Everybody goes through this. But the good news is, with work, we can all learn to train ourselves to beat our natural instincts. This isn't actually a quote. I read this somewhere and I kind of paraphrased it and it was from a long time ago, but I thought I loved it, right? If a mindset is something you firmly believe about yourself, wrote somebody sometime, and there you have it. So there's two types of mindsets, right? There's a growth mindset and there's a fixed mindset. Somebody with a growth mindset embraces challenges, they welcome failures, they know that their abilities can be developed. Somebody with a fixed mindset avoids challenges, they give up easily, and they believe that their abilities are fixed. So somebody with a growth mindset might say, my effort determines my success. Somebody with a fixed mindset is just gonna think, I have no control over this. And this is where we wanna be. We wanna have a growth mindset. And it's something just really important to think about. It's something that everybody should be aware of. So this leads me to the next section here. I'm going to talk a little bit about people and community. If you haven't already guessed it, we have a quote. And it's sometimes you got to create what you want to be a part of. And this is by Jerry Weitzman. And it doesn't matter if you're managing a team or if you're an individual contributor. When it comes to building community, everyone is a creator. And it's really important as a creator to try to build something that you want to be a part of. Here's some things I've learned along the way about building community. One, think about the people you work with, the people on your team as people, not resources. A resource isn't a great way to think about people. It implies that they aren't individually valuable. That's why the name human resources is dropping away, and you're hearing a lot more of people and culture, people in organizational development. So always think of humans as people or teammates. Number two is you can have the most talented team in the world. If they don't trust each other, if they don't trust your leadership, if they don't trust the organization, your team is never going to live up to their true talent level. A team's ability to build a trusting relationship is just as important, if not more important, than their ability within their actual craft. Next is you'll never get new and innovative ideas if everyone is the same. Right? Different perspectives equals better decisions. Diversity is incredibly important. Diversity helps make people feel comfortable when they're expressing their opinions. A great way to build a team is by relying on senior members. They have experience, they've been around. Maybe they have a lot of legacy knowledge, but put together mentoring programs, pair more senior members up with more of the mid-level and junior team members. Mentoring is incredibly powerful when it comes to building a community. Now, we're all at work to work, but that doesn't mean it has to be business all the time. Make it fun, right? People have a good time. They're more likely to get to know one another, and they're more likely to trust one another. And if you can get people to like each other and trust each other and respect each other, the work actually does become a lot better. Remember, be human. Everyone on your team is a person. Start a meeting by asking for good news. A few jobs ago, I had a manager, it's actually a bad manager. This is one of those people that I did not want to take stuff away from, right? But this person did one thing, which to me was actually very valuable. This person always started a meeting by asking if there's any good news. It was a really good way to start a meeting on a positive note. And then lastly, encourage a growth mindset culture. Encourage people on your team or that you work with, right? You don't have to be a manager. Encourage people to want to learn. let people know that they can always develop and they can always improve. Make it fun, right? This is an example of what we call a gen question, the first one you all saw a little while ago. Whenever we have team meetings, we always start first by asking for good news, and then we ask a gen question. And there's somebody on my team, her name's Jen. She has a list of questions that are just kind of random and meaningless. But we always ask these after good news. If Jen's out there virtually today, shout out. So here's an example of some of those questions, but it's fun, right? It's just a few minutes of useless banter before you actually get into the actual meeting. You can't build a community if you don't break rules. So here's something that I picked up at the gym. Everyone was in it together. Everyone was there because they were focused on getting in shape. That became something everyone had in common. The funny thing is, most people love pizza, right? They like bagels, they like beer after a workout, right? What I started to realize is we can occasionally have happy hours. I'm using occasionally kind of conservatively here, but have happy hours after workouts. People get to know each other, they hang out, they bond, they start to talk. They want to be part of that community. They support each other more. They're in it together. Now, the parallel to this at Priceline is we break rules by intentionally having meetings during the week that have absolutely nothing to do with work, right? We'll plan meetings where we'll role play a game. We have a social chairperson on the team. So we'll have a meeting and just hang out, have a good time. We've picked movies where everyone on the team will watch a movie. We'll come together and we'll have a movie review. During Halloween, we've done a lot of virtual happy hour Halloweens where everyone wears a costume and selects a virtual background. I always promise whoever wins is going to get a reward. They've actually probably never got those rewards, but still, it's the thought that counts.
Respect the target, man.
There you go. So, kind of coming back to this point, right? We test a lot at Priceline. We listen to our data. We make adjustments as we go. That's how you build a product. Now, it's also how you build a team, it's how you build a process, or it's how you help solve a solution or come up with a solution to actual problem. Treat it like a product. Try new things, pay attention, learn, and iterate. So that's my roller coaster story. Hopefully there was something in there that was helpful to you. Enjoy the ride. It moves really quickly. And the last thing I want to leave you with here is tell your story, because it does matter. And thank you. Questions? Yes. There is a microphone over there. Hold on, do you want a microphone? You want to stand there?
Repeat it for the online people.
Yeah, hold on, let me grab the, yeah, there's like a green button, that's right. There's a green button.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you for sharing your experience. So before you mentioned that when you were first transitioning from your gym business back to design,
Yep.
you weren't sure how to sell your skills. But now, how would you say that your gym experience has helped you with your design role or life overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few ways. One of the things I realized, pretty soon after I got out of the gym is I learned a lot more about, I understood business a lot better and how businesses work, right? In a way that I didn't understand before. And like I said, to me, it was like, I felt like I got my MBA, right? So I had a completely different appreciation and an understanding of how businesses work and how to speak more of a business language to help me as a designer. And then there's a lot of other things, like I talked about community. Like I think I do a pretty good job of building communities, but I think the reason why I could do that is because I spent time at a gym and realized that it wasn't about the equipment, it was about bringing people together and finding a common interest amongst those people and getting them to trust each other, right? At the gym, one of the things I learned is people stayed because their friends were there. They supported each other. They saw results because their friends encouraged them. Then when it came time to renew, people stuck around because their friends were there, right? So there was a big community aspect of it also, and I think that became very relevant. Sure. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, actually, since you have the management experience, I guess I wanted to ask the follow-up of that from the hiring committee's perspective. Like, how do you train a hiring team to value that experience that may not have like a direct correlation to the bullet points on the job listing?
Well, if I'm understanding so I think it's because if you build a culture and people believe in that culture, then I think people are going to behave in the way that you want them to behave, right? So I think, my team, I think we have a great culture on my team. People are incredibly collaborative. They like to work with one another. I think they trust each other, but I think that type of approach that they take to their day-to-day work spreads when it comes to bringing in new people. I'm not sure if that answered the question or not.
I think so. I mean, can you think of an example maybe where you hired someone where like, wow, this person didn't have the most relevant experience, but we actually saw the potential for them to excel at this job for another reason?
So, yeah, it's a good question. I think, but they're kind of different things. So I think, and this is a whole other, could be, we could talk after, because it's a whole other big topic, but it's like evaluating and how do you find the right people. And one of the things that, I look for is, I don't know if it's the right way to say it, but, finding a cultural fit, somebody who you think is going to fit in on your team. And depending on what level they are, you evaluate it a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, finding somebody who wants to collaborate and who wants to learn and who's passionate about travel and they want to be a part of the team, that's the most important thing, right? And to some degree, and depending on the level, that's more important than your actual experience or ability within craft, because that's something that you could train and develop over time. And I think if you give people honest feedback and constructive feedback, people are going to grow and learn. And if they're not, it's because they're not really listening to what you're hearing, and that becomes a completely different conversation. Sure.
Is it on? Hello? Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing your story. And as I was listening, I could see a lot, I could really relate to a lot of things you said, because my journey was very similar, except for instead of a gym, I got into career coaching.
Right.
But the growth mindset, all this stuff, I could really relate to. So my question to you is, once you decided, I'm going to go back into the corporate, how long did it take you
To find a job?
to find a job?
It took a while. I mean, it was, I'm going to say in the 4 to 6 month range of just having conversations that were going nowhere. Then, like I mentioned, I got a little bit lucky because I had a former colleague who was running a team, and they brought me into it. Once I started doing freelance work again, then it was, I had current stuff that was within the time. So, I understood what responsive design was at that point, but I had work, right? And having work made it easier to move on to the next thing. Now, I did bounce around freelancing for a good year and a half before I actually landed on a full-time job. But it took time, right? And there was, doing it all over again, I would have stayed current with the industry that I had left. I didn't do that, and that hurt me. The other thing is, and now there's so many different careers and things that people could do that are relevant to being a designer. Like if you're career coaching, you're helping people solve problems, right? If you're a designer, you're solving problems through design. There's a lot of carryover and there's a lot of parallel there. So for me, I wish I would have really thought about that. Like, what was my story over the past few years, and how is that story relevant to what I want to do today? Because when I would go on interviews and people would ask me about what I'm doing, I was not able to articulate it or answer it in a way that made it seem relevant to what they were looking for. And if I had to go back in time and do it again, I would be able to give a very relevant answer that would have probably made a difference much sooner.
What are some of the ways that, like, some of your favorite ways to stay current then in this realm? And you just voiced how there's a lot of different aspects of design, but what would have been beneficial when you were trying to come back in, and then what do you use now to sort of stay on top of things?
I mean, so for one thing, this type of thing, what you're doing now is great. Like, go to conferences, seek out content. That's an amazing thing to do. And there's a lot of free content out there. There's a lot of podcasts. There's a lot of, find something that you're interested in and chase down that content. LinkedIn, follow people on LinkedIn who inspire you, right? So, I would encourage anyone to think about the things that you're interested in and go out there and seek that content, whether it's coming to a conference like this or whether it's listening to a podcast, whether it's subscribing to a newsletter, it's out there. The most important thing is you have to figure out what those things are. I think a lot of people look at it and think, well, somebody has to tell me or my manager at work has to tell me the things I'm interested in. That's probably going to go wrong because the things I think somebody should be interested in are probably not the things they actually want to be interested in. So I would really encourage you to find those things that interest you and motivate you and to seek out content about those things because there's a lot of it out there and most of it's free, aside from conferences.
Speak a little bit to challenges or difficulties you've had in creating the culture you wanted. Let's say people hate pizza, or someone says it's a waste of time, or maybe somebody just doesn't want to do the group thing. Right?
Yeah, if somebody didn't like pizza, they were gone. That's an easy solve. But it's not, look, you don't have to like pizza, you don't have to like beer. People still hung out, right? They were still kind of part of the group. It wasn't really about the pizza or the beer. It was really about bringing people together, right, and getting them to talk and find that common interest. And everywhere you go, it's a little bit different. I think at Priceline, I think we've done a really good job building an amazing team. It wasn't just me building that team. It was me getting to know people and people getting to know one another and realize, okay, like we all have a common interest, which is design and research, right? That's something that we all believe in. That's something that we all do. So that's one common point right there. The other piece of it is just, finding ways to bring people together, like I said, and not talk about work. You start to realize, okay, here's the Netflix shows that people are watching. This is what they're watching on Amazon, and they love to talk about this stuff. And it starts to build a relationship. So it's really just helping find common interest amongst the people around you. And it does get people, it's a simple thing, but it does get people to trust one another and to rely on one another. People don't have to be best friends, right? But they have to respect each other and they have to trust each other.
Testing, okay. Was there a point in your career where you had like an aha moment, like you started to connect the dots between your roller coaster of a career, or is it in retrospect where you're looking back and saying people, community, culture, like that is, what's connecting and helping you look in the future as well?
I think when it comes back to, like that idea of connecting the dots, I think there's literally not a week goes by where something comes up and I'm reminded of something that happened, whether it was a few months ago or a few years ago, and it's a similar situation as to what I'm going through now. And I started to realize, well, like, there's so much relevancy between things that have happened and what's happening now. Like at Yahoo, for example, going through a round of layoffs and taking over a department, then years later, all of a sudden, that manager leaves, and do you want to take over this team? And then looking back on it, it's like, wow, okay, this happened to me once already, and this is how I handled it. This is how I started working with the people who that morning were my peers, and now I'm their manager. There was a lesson there, So I think it's really when you really start to think about your story and your past experiences and reflecting on things that have happened, there is just so much stuff that starts to unsurface that helps you in the day-to-day.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
As someone who's newer to the design space, I'm curious, when you left the design world and came back, what, if any, emphasis was put on having a portfolio? And what did that process look like for you then versus now?
Yeah, everyone wanted to see a portfolio, and that was one of my problems. Like, being at a gym for a few years, that a portfolio would have looked entirely different than it would have looked before I started. After I started doing freelance work, I started putting all of that work together in a portfolio, and that helped me get my next full-time job. I think when you're starting out in design, and I'm going to say something which is probably very debatable and some people in this room might not agree with, but I think when you're starting off in design, I think there's a certain period of time where the portfolio is incredibly important. And then I think there's a period of time as you get more experience and you've been doing it longer and you're leading teams. I don't think a portfolio is really that important at that point because you can see where people have been and what they've done and how long they've been at certain places, right? And that all starts to mean something.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I just want to say it's refreshing not to have an AI talk. Like, these are my favorite types of talks, just because, like,
Yeah.
this is life. This is actually, like, what your career is going to look like. Two things that resonated and then a question. I think being able to learn from those jobs you didn't like
Yeah.
or like a bad manager has helped me tremendously. It's like, don't think of that as a bad thing. That's a free education right there in what not to
100%,
do.
yeah.
And then the second thing is fear of failure. Like, we started a small agency and we might fail tomorrow, right? Probably not tomorrow, but whatever. And like, listening to my co-founder saying, Alex, I've seen you fail so many times in life. We went to college together. Like, I've seen you do dumb things.
Right.
It's like, you can't fear it, right? And if you unlock that, that's extremely powerful. Question for you, though. Now you're in this big title, awesome job. Would you go back into entrepreneurship?
So if you're asking would I go back and do what I did all over again, 100%. Would I go back into entrepreneurship now? At this point, I would say no. But plans change. Who knows? Maybe that will change at some point. But yeah, no, I wouldn't. Like right now, it's definitely not something that's on the roadmap. I feel like I did it, right? And it's something I always wanted to do. And had I not done it, and you asked that question, I'd probably be like, yeah, it's like something I've always wanted to do, and you know, I probably will at some point.
A bit about this the other night, but just
Yeah.
curious how you keep yourself like creatively inspired, and also your team, being that, you know, an in-house team working on, you know, a singular product with a set brand.
I mean, for me, it's doing things like this. You know, like going out and speaking and talking about things that you've done. It's never easy, and there's always a challenge, and there's some creativity that I think goes in terms of that, in terms of putting slides together and putting a story together that makes sense and hopefully helps people. You know, in terms of the team, hopefully people are feeling inspired creatively by what they're doing at work, but it's also encouraging people to think about things outside of work that they're interested in doing and carving out time and setting aside time to do those things, whether it's writing, whether it's doing music, it could be anything. You know, work gets busy, right? There's no getting around that, but making sure that people carve out time to do things that actually fulfill them creatively or, you know, kind of serve their interests and they have time to do it. We do, I encourage everyone on the team, like, you know, find something, you know, find things that you're interested in and try to carve out time during the week to make sure you could do those things.
So you just mentioned, you know, the creativity that goes along with creating the slides and creating the presentation and telling the story in a way that hopefully resonates with your audience. Can you speak more to that process and how you go about that?
Yeah, so I started getting into this type of content because I used to, and I think I mentioned something about this earlier, but I used to talk a lot about design and about process and conversion. And what I started to realize is I would go to conferences and I would talk about those things, and I felt like everyone was saying the same thing or something very similar. It's just our slides looked a little bit different, right? And so I started to think about, well, how can I do something that's kind of more unique and more original? That's where I really started to think about, you know, my own story and, you know, dealing with change and going through the unknown and taking a chance and trying a new career. And I was like, okay, there's a story that goes along with it. I didn't know how to tell that story. And so even, you know, like what I went through today, months ago, I put this together and I was like, okay, I'm kind of struggling with this. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense. I started working with a storytelling coach, right? Somebody who specializes, like they tell stories and they go, this person goes to different organizations and he'll work with sales teams, with leaders to help them figure out how to structure and put their story together. I met with him. He took a look at what I did, completely turned it upside down. I walked out of it like, man, like I just did all this work and it's terrible. But listening to it, what he had to say and how you structure a story and kind of bring, you're making a point, but you're bringing some of your own experiences into it to help drive that point was all incredibly helpful. And now it's like, to me, it's like a hobby, and it's a work in progress.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more.
All right. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Having so many past experiences in different industries, do you have any insight on these different industries? And hypothetically, if you were not at Priceline anymore, then your next place, do you have anything in mind in terms of the industry, or does that not really matter to you?
In terms of the industry?
Or like culture, yeah.
So I'm sorry, what's the
The question would be, the first question would be like insights to the types of industries that you've had experiences at previously, like Yahoo, RGA, Quora, et cetera. And then hypothetically, if you were to like move on from Priceline, is there something that you have in mind now from those past experiences that you would look into?
No, I don't know if it's just me being really bad at thinking about that thing, or it's just something that's not on my mind. I have no idea, like, what industry or what I would do next. I kind of, that concept of the dots connect, I really believe that whatever would happen next is kind of just like one of my dots, and it's happening for a certain reason and probably related to something that I've done in the past. I mean, I really like being in product. I think building products is super interesting, especially when you're iterative and you're looking at data. And for me, I've been working on e-commerce, since the early 2000s. So it's definitely like the space that I would want to be in.
All right, cool. One more time for Ryan.
All right. Thank you all.